Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Today, we are very excited to welcome back Psychedelics Today CEO and co-founder Joe Moore. There's been a lot of focus on expanding in the developing world of psychedelic medicine, an area that there's so much education and knowledge kind of required to really understand as it continues to develop. So excited to spend some time with Joe today to get a better sense of where we are with psychedelics in the current moment, Psychedelics Today, if you will, and where things might go from here. So a good reminder, if you're out there and you have questions and you're joining us live, you can always drop a question in the chat and we'll try to get to them as we go along. Again, as mentioned, I feel like this is a space that just requires so much education. I think there's a lot of questions around. So take advantage of this time. With all that said, Joe, thanks for joining us again. Really appreciate it. How is your week rounding out?
Oh, it's been lovely so far. Did some really nice time in Aspen over the weekend and now back to work. And yeah, really brilliant weather here in Colorado.
That is awesome. Beats the East Coast. I feel like where we've been still pretty much besieged by snow. It's finally melting now, but yeah, it's nice to get a little bit of spring in the air, I think, in general as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, so I feel like last time we had you on, it was October roughly of last year. I think we covered a lot in terms of Psychedelics Today and, the story and kind of where things were from a psychedelics perspective. Would love to kind of check in and see where we are in March of 2026 in terms of sort of the general landscape high level.
Oh, geez. Well, things keep progressing. So we're getting much closer to having psilocybin available via a company, Compass Pathways, with FDA approval. So that should be really interesting to see how that plays out. Most of us are expecting to see it in early 2027, be prescribable. There's going to be all sorts of interesting conversations that have to happen since this is a first in history moment. We're seeing other drugs come right behind it, 5-MeO-DMT nasal sprays with Atai Beckley, and kind of a recent merger. I don't know if that one made the presses, but two major companies merged. I forget if we had this conversation last time, but there was a $1.2 billion acquisition of Ibogaine IP from Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals to AbbVie, largest ever psychedelic acquisition. That was mostly an IP acquisition. So fascinating to see that there's actual movement happening. States keep moving, and there's just so much activity.
Yeah, I think it's been, we've talked about it in the past, just a really interesting time. I think the term psychedelic renaissance has been thrown around a lot, and I think that is kind of true. It is interesting to see kind of where we are in the current kind of spot, like you're saying, where we are seeing kind of that materially show up in companies really pushing this forward. We'll talk more, of course, about kind of the state programs that are progressing things beyond sort of decriminalization into kind of a new sphere, really trying to offer it as medicine. I know there's also a federal element that we'll talk about as well. So an interesting space, an interesting time, I think, to be talking about all of this in general. I did want to spend some time just sort of from a high level as well, in terms of what has developed through. Has it been more sort of on the medical side, policy side, recreational side? I know there's a ton of different areas. Is it all sort of balanced? Any sort of thoughts there?
We'll start with the kind of illicit side first. It's really interesting. There seems to be new brands popping up all the time, branding, consumer packaged goods, trying to experiment with what does consumer trust look like? How do we know that if we see this brand, we can trust it and feel okay about it? There were some major breakups in that kind of space a few years ago, and I think it's kind of testing itself again. There's some interesting products being sold now that are not federally scheduled, but really similar experientially to things that are illicit. So that's fascinating. There's all sorts of issues and complexities there, but that's a business that's blowing up. On the federal side, we're seeing some really interesting traction around this bill. Centers of Excellence, the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, is working to support I think Senators Bergman and Carrera, working to bring this one forward, where we would have 5 different centers of excellence in the Veterans Administration where we could actually do these treatments and do research at the same time at a very high level. And that might be the fast track we need to bring some of these things over the finish line, because as we might have discussed last time, these things are often not as patentable as people would like from a drug perspective. They've been around for a really long time, but we know that they're safe and we should be implementing them. So this is kind of an interesting conversation about bringing difficult to patent drug over the finish line.
Mhm.
Maybe it is a public-private partnership like Texas is trying to lead with their 50 million they put into ibogaine somewhat recently.
Yeah, really interesting. The first point that you brought up kind of reminds me a little bit of the parallels. I think for our audience, they're very tuned in to sort of the cannabis landscape and what's going on there. It does sort of feel very similar in some ways. I know there's a lot of differences and important differences between psychedelics and cannabis, but kind of that same thing where we saw the intoxicating hemp market spring up because people want access to these compounds, to these things. And again, without a great way to get access to it, you do see sometimes that spring up. But like you're mentioning, that does come with its own kind of tricky elements sometimes to navigate. You can have bad actors, and it's hard to separate the good actors from the bad actors. But I think ultimately it is something that people have a renewed interest in and a renewed kind of support of generally psychedelics wise, at least, which is great to hear. Speaking of which, actually, so I know you were recently featured in Forbes kind of on an article covering a lot of the psychedelic space and also kind of covering the, I guess, public response or public support, I guess, ultimately when it comes to psychedelics. Would love to kind of dig into that in a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about that because I think it was talking about a quarter of Americans kind of have support for psychedelics. What can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, it was wild to see this. So an American think tank, Rand Corp, put out a big research um, publication about American attitudes towards psychedelics, and we saw um, substantial support for legalization, decriminalization in this study. We also saw a huge amount of people are actually using psychedelics, even though it's illicit. And um, the article showed that there was still a diversity of opinions. Some of the most insightful stuff I saw, Mackenzie, was about the 1990s cannabis market and kind of where we were in the 90s in terms of public attitudes towards cannabis, and then how long that took to work towards legalization, which was still a long time. But what we have now is the advent of the internet, and people are just really excited about it. And we have a lot of influencers, not just like, musicians and artists. We have scientists, athletes, and politicians also supporting it. So my estimation is that public attitudes will shift far quicker than cannabis attitudes did. Even though we still didn't win that cannabis fight,
We're
my
still
home
fighting.
state of New Hampshire, it's still not legal. Live free or
Yeah.
die. Um,
Yeah.
so,
No.
and what I think that report really indicated is that, hey, Americans are here. They want this. They're doing it now. My point to the journalist that wrote that piece was the government really needs to start meeting the people where they are. It's a public health situation if we just ignore it. And we should be doing our best to understand it and then to serve the public so that we have positive health outcomes from this public movement. Prohibition will not work here, never has worked.
We've seen that
And
time and time again, even though people will continue to just fight the war on drugs. I know it's frustrating, but I think we do have, like you're saying, even with the internet, just better information, better access to other people who have you're able to connect with people in your community or even beyond your community and say, hey, I've been struggling with a certain thing. What have you used that's helped? And really be able to kind of connect and not get so frightened, I guess, out of, again, I think they still require care. They still require education, especially if you're using them. But I think, yeah, ultimately trends have changed there. And even honestly, I think we talked about this last time maybe, but just sort of attitudes towards mental health and not feeling as embarrassed or private about that and being able to say, hey, I want to advocate for myself and advocate for better tools, better access, what's out there. And I think that's a net positive too. So yeah, hopefully we see that momentum continue kind of across the spectrum, but obviously, especially when it comes to psychedelics. Yeah, I think great to see that article, great to see that coverage, very high profile coverage, which I think is great. So appreciate you doing the work there as well. I did, before we kind of get into more depth on the state side and federal side as well, I did just want to kind of touch base on, the education around psychedelics, what you're doing with psychedelics today, because I think, being in this article is helpful to kind of get the message out, share kind of perspective there. But I know a lot of people are still looking for information on psychedelics. Would love to hear sort of high level, what you've been sharing or focused on from a psychedelics today perspective in terms of keeping people kind of in the loop and attuned to what's changing for psychedelics.
Right. So we, for the longest time, were doing 2 episodes a week of our podcast, doing weekly news rundowns. We actually just started rebooting our news segment, doing roughly 30-minute segments, hopefully 3 times a week, to keep everybody up to date. I also started doing news roundups for my email list because there's so much activity happening. It's impossible to track it all if you're just a working person trying to get through their day. You know, I can't even imagine the kind of level of information you need to get through McKinsey to do your work. And so I'm trying to figure out how to condense that for people so they have a tight, usable source that makes sense for their, personal and business lives.
Yeah.
So our email list is working on that. We're trying to develop some interesting products for more specific folks like yourself to help make it a little simpler. And
Genuinely.
I'll tell you
It's been
about that
helpful.
one. Yeah. And so what we have been doing for the public and public education is developing training. We started developing education 8, 9 years ago so that college kids would have an easier time. We wanted to see less people end up needing serious medical care because of psychedelics, which can happen. Sometimes you end up, needing a therapist or more. And how can we avoid that? And it's through careful training, making sure people have a good framework going in. And we saw a lot of success. And this matches what a lot of the global drug policy and harm reduction groups are doing. So we did that, therapists and doctors. So we're just kind of educating the clinical folks. I found out recently that there's a fair amount of politicians listening to our work, and that is informing state and federal policy. Our work is being featured now in universities, including some Ivy League universities, which is great. I think I was able to actually present at Stanford within the last 6, 12 months,
Wow.
which is really helpful to know that young kids are getting, some really good insight into what is one of the more interesting aspects of the space. And we'll hire writers often too to flesh out things that I can't personally opine on or write on.
Yeah,
So
very,
we're
very
trying to
cool.
do a full spectrum coverage.
Yeah, I think that's great to be hitting all those different important pockets and kind of groups and things like that. You mentioned the podcast. Can you give a plug for where people can find it? I just want to make sure people, if they're staying in tune with it, in touch with it.
Right. Thank you for that. Psychedelics Today is the name of the show. You can catch a lot of our live streams on YouTube. And we post our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and really anywhere you listen to podcasts. So follow us on socials and you'll see all that stuff.
Easy to find. That sounds good. Sounds like Shroom Sleep is a subscriber already, which is awesome to hear. Love to see it. I see Traveler Jeff mentioning neuroplastics. Plastics are inevitable. I am curious. I feel like there has been more conversations around psychedelics and sort of calling them, neuroplasticity drugs,
Let's
because I
do
think
it.
there is that bias, right? There's that bias of psychedelics. It seems scary and 1960s and all these things, whatever. I don't know. Are you seeing a shift? Are you positioning things differently? What's sort of the take there? Curious.
It's a good perspective. I think you said the dollar cost average in. I think there's some interesting
Yeah.
stuff there. So there's some really interesting molecules that are coming around that are based on psychedelic molecules that don't have the psychedelic effect. Recently, the I think head of FDA psychiatric drugs division said, I never want to see the word psychedelic in my applications, in any applications coming across my desk. You have to use something that's more specific. And I find that an interesting position. It's a dirty word, and that's why I use it. I think I want to kind of fight that stigma. But if you're trying really hard and using other people's money to bring a drug across the finish line through the FDA, you have to be a little bit more tactful. And no shame on anybody doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
If it's a
former
difference,
head
I
of
guess.
my old,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
former head of my former PR agency kind of really worked hard to bring those terms around neuroplastogen, psychoplastogen, things like this. And, I was rolling my eyes going, that's not for me. Maybe it's for you in the industry, but that's not for me to do. And, what I've been seeing is a lot of companies are coming forward and calling their drugs these things, which is good, in that it might get drugs to people sooner. And what we're seeing is really strong effect size for some indications with drugs that are not psychedelic at all, but are based on these psychedelic molecules. In terms of psychedelic, you're not having those big effects that we kind of talk about in terms of kind of sensory manipulation, different experience of your mind, things like that. So a drug that looks like LSD molecularly, but no psychoactive effect, it has a strong hope profile for people experiencing traumatic brain injury. There's so many things like this. I I have an unpopular opinion where I think it's okay that we do this. Some people in the space are not okay with it, but I think anything that makes medicines easier to administer is good. Perhaps we won't have the most maximal effect if we don't have those effects in there for some indications, but for others, we might do really well. So
I think,
I'm bullish. I think there's a lot of companies you could look at that are doing stuff like this, and do your diligence and see if it's right for you to throw some cash in.
yeah, I think it's highly debated, like you're saying, if you need those hallucinogenic effects or sort of that psychedelic experience to pair with, doing some of these drugs to have the full effects. But I think ultimately a lot of these companies are taking their own paths, their own way of development. And if it ultimately expands the range of tools, again, as long as it goes through the full kind of vetting and everything else, seems like an interesting thing. Again, it's not going to be a one fit all kind of tool, I guess, ultimately for people, even though it does seem like it's able to address some of these more complex affliction sounds so
Yeah.
old-timey, but complex issues, I think, for people ultimately. So really, really
We're
interesting.
looking at the FDA like approval process. We have to be better and safer. Like the drug has to work better
Yes.
and or be safer. And that's the criteria. So if you can do that, you're in really great shape in terms of drug development. And I think this is just going to be kind of a march of progress and science. Like we're going to keep seeing new molecules, new ways of approaching conditions. Signaling is nuance. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there is a lot of nuance here, but it's also like what's better for what indication, because psilocybin is not just for psychotherapy and psychiatric conditions. It's for brain injuries, it's for pain conditions. There's a lot more.
Yeah.
So this is a really big sector, and I think we minimize the sector when we try to only put it into psychiatry.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's fair enough. Out of curiosity, I feel like there's been a lot of, on like the federal side, I don't think we talked about this last time because I don't think it was in place last time. But speaking of looking at drugs and that are, work better than kind of what is out there, I know the FDA fast tracking has become a big important part of some of the psychedelics, just because if they're novel, new, there's nothing currently in place that like properly addresses some of these issues. They can be candidates for fast tracking. How does that sort of change the game ultimately for kind of the psychedelic space as these drugs are coming through?
So what the psychedelic industry has going against it is that a lot of these drugs are scheduled, and that increases cost for drug development. FDA fast tracking ostensibly reduces costs. It's a method where the FDA co-develops a lot of your processes and says, okay, this is substantially better than anything we have. Let's do it together because we want you to win and we want you to bring this across the finish line. So if you co-develop with them and you're really tight with compliance and really honest with them, ostensibly your drug will get over the finish line soon. And you have to be really tight, Lycos maps with their reunion, maybe now they're calling it. They renamed from Lycos recently. I can't recall the name. There was some real potentially compliance issues around staying tight with the FDA story and project. So if you can do that, theoretically, they're going to hold your hand and work you through the process at a more advanced clip than drugs that don't get this. So this is a huge thing to get, and you should try to get that if you're trying to develop drugs, and then respect the hell out of it and make sure you're following those rules.
Yeah, that's fair. But it feels like a kind of material way to signal support from the government ultimately that this is something that wants to be invested in, wants to be developed, wants to, exist ultimately. Because I think coming into the new administration a year ago-ish, I think there was a sense that there was support for these kind of more novel outside of the normal frame types of drugs. I know right to try was a big thing and a big element of everything. But I think seeing support show up in a material way makes a difference. I am also curious, you mentioned sort of the renaming. I feel like there's been mergers in this space, but there's also been a lot of kind of rebranding, renaming. Do you have a sense of what that's coming, what is spurring that?
I think it's exactly what we just chatted about, is getting away from that kind of scary brand of psychedelics so that they're not exposed to that kind of brand stigma anymore. And so I think I've even seen some groups like kind of do it once or twice in recent past. I think Definium, formerly MindMed, I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're doing LSD MDMA, LSD and MDMA together. I think they might be even looking at 2-CPE, which is fascinating. They had to do a big rebrand because they were so branded in psychedelics, and they saw those signals from FDA and said, okay, we need to actually do this different so that we don't get shut down.
Really interesting. Yeah, I know. Also, I think Cybin transitioned into Heal Us, and I think all those things.
Right.
Interesting from an investor perspective, I think, as well, just to have sort of a different setup. And I don't know if that kind of gives a fresh look for investors at kind of the space, but neither here nor there, I guess. But all right, well then, you mentioned some of the state story. I did want to just drill in a little bit on that front. What can you tell us about how things have been developing from a state perspective? It sounds like federally still seeing some good support, which is great. But I know we're kind of moving along on a state level as well.
Right. So Oregon was the first state to approve a legal regulated access program. Colorado followed suit a few years later. Oregon's program has been challenging, and it's challenging for a few reasons. I think some really well-intentioned people kind of put these laws together to say, hey, this is what we should vote on. And then conservative regulators put into place the most conservative version. There was an article that MJ Biz put out the other day about high taxation in cannabis and how that kind of drives black markets. And I think there's so let's rewind the tape like 10, 15 years. There's some really great work published in the Lancet on the drug harm scale. Turns out psilocybin and LSD are kind of top 3 safest drugs of use popularly in humans. And we put in one of the most restrictive kind of access programs possible in Oregon and Colorado. And, I can't blame government workers for wanting to protect their jobs, but I think the way that this rolled out was so conservative that it made it not a very friendly environment for businesses to operate. I came very close 2 different times, one in Colorado and one in Oregon, to enter this kind of regulated space. And at the very last moment said, I don't think it's here. I don't think this is the right move. We shouldn't invest our time and capital here. And I think a lot of businesses are doing the same. I know a lot of businesses are actually shutting down because it's really hard to operate in such a tightly regulated market. That said, a lot of people are getting help because there's a lot of people who only want to access this kind of stuff through kind of legal means, right? Despite the federal situation.
Sure.
And they're willing to pay a premium for that because they know the product is tested and safe. They know the person went through some XYZ training and holds a license of sorts. And that helps a lot of people. We have seen support from philanthropy come in different ways for these businesses because a lot of philanthropists don't want to see this fail. So, for instance, that service center, we're friendly with them. They're having a hard time. Let's go run 20 of our people through that and do some kind of off-campus retreat for that charity or this business as part of this regulated mushroom experience. So, it's a hard environment. People are talking about it and looking at it. I think that the states want it to succeed, but I think that it's a really challenging thing to this is a word I don't use very often, Mackenzie. Like, how do we deregulate this regulated psychedelic market to a degree that it makes sense for business operators to be here and to attract money? Mm-hmm. So it's challenging, but it's important. New Mexico is working really hard on rolling out its own program. It'll look very different, I believe, but it'll be informed by the wins and losses in Colorado and Oregon. And a number of states will be following suit in the near term, I think, and hope.
Yeah, fair enough. I do think it's a little bit of a momentum game. Again, not to keep drawing parallels to cannabis, but I do think with about half of states in the U.S. having a recreational program, I think each additional one becomes easier and easier. You have more data, like you're saying, to look back at previous states, what has worked, what hasn't, and kind of refine that process a little bit more. I know the demand is still very much there. I know we've heard stories about people who are really at the end of the rope, and either they are able to find care in the U.S. or they're willing to go outside of the U.S. Just because it is more of that kind of do or die ultimately in terms of getting care. So I think the demand is fortunately or unfortunately a pretty constant, and hopefully we do see some more of these states kind of open up. You don't think that it's going to be sort of a rescheduling component? Because I know, again, there are different compounds. If you're looking at ketamine versus psilocybin, different sort of scheduling there. Not thinking it's going to be a rescheduling game. I think it's going to be not trying to.
So, do you offhand know that the recent Trump EO on cannabis, was that the first time that there has been a drug that was removed from the schedule to a lower status?
Well, so it technically hasn't even happened yet. So I think he issued a directive to get it done to move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, but not to deschedule it. So I think it is the first time in a
Right.
long
It's
time.
just like
So
a lowering in status,
lowering
right?
and
So
starting
I
it.
think
Yeah.
that's important.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen when Compass becomes the Compass psilocybin product will become legal and regulated? It has to also then become legal to prescribe in each state. So the states adopted kind of this Controlled Substances Act framework, and each state that made it, an illegal drug in the state, illicit to possess drug, has to then come up with a way to shift the law enforcement priority on these things. So Colorado, along with a number of other states, have bills going that as soon, if approved, as soon as these drugs are approved, the state legal status will shift as well. So when Compass comes across the finish line with the FDA, and assuming, apparently this is not a given, assuming the DEA will also reschedule it to Schedule 1, I actually don't know which way is 1 or 3.
Schedule 1 is the most intense. So Schedule 1 is
All right.
like
So it's already there.
It's already there.
Schedule 1.
Yes.
So it'll lower it to a Schedule 3, so it'll be more like a Tylenol with codeine or something.
Yeah.
Something that certainly has medical value, but we don't necessarily want everybody to have it according to FDA, DEA. So it's not my opinion. But anyway, that'll be the first time in history that'll happen through the FDA DEA protocol. And then we'll get to see that pathway prove out with other psychedelics as they come across the finish line too, which would be really interesting. So companies will have to have enough size to actually be lobbying every state for approval in the state, which I think is really problematic. And it's an additional cost that I don't know is, given how much we want people to have the right medicine now, I don't know that this is appropriate. Like, how lobbyists are going to say it's appropriate, right? Because they get a lot of cash from this work.
Sure.
I think we really need to say, no, like, let's push something through somehow, some way that makes the cost a lot lower and the speed of this process a lot lower so that we can help more people sooner.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And note how I'm like a both hand here. Like I really want to see all of these drugs come through the federal pipeline. I want to see states succeed in their programs, and I want to see drug policy just radically reform so people can more safely access the things that they want to access. Kind of like a Cato Institute perspective on drug policy, for instance.
Yeah, fair enough. I am curious in terms of the lobbying. I know that is sort of unfortunately not quite a given in the US, but it feels like it's such a key part of how things get done, unfortunately. But I know sometimes there are competing interests that raise the cost for lobbying and all of that stuff. You don't see necessarily like big pharma being sort of an oppositional thing. So I think ultimately it would benefit big pharma, like we've seen obviously with Johnson & Johnson acquisition, first Spravato.
It's one of their most successful drugs, right?
Exactly. So, do you at least see that being as a relatively low spend because they're not fighting against another big industry that's trying to say, let's kind of squash this. They're offering potentially better tools. It's ultimately an opportunity maybe for big pharma. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It absolutely is. I think so. I have the typical business conspiracy mind. Like, I think there has been some low level spend for the last bunch of years on this from big pharma. I think similarly to cannabis, like, and I'll join you in this, I think there's an intent to kind of squish valuation through kind of like, light PR spend. So valuations can become lower so that they can, spend more time doing their diligence to find out who or what they want to acquire and or do their own drug development around. Like AbbVie made the choice to do Ibogaine. I think as soon as Compass Pathways comes across the finish line, we're going to see large cap pharma racing to do acquisition and drug development. They just need one positive signal that says, yes, it's safe to do this. And that's my guess. And I think, yes, they're just waiting in the wings, Mackenzie.
Very cool. All right. It's an interesting time again. So it sounds like I know Compass has been in the news lately just because of phase 3 and
Mhm.
how things are moving along, which is great. Any other sort of, I mean, you can dig more into Compass if you want, but any other sort of players right now that you have a particular eye on, that you're kind of seeing? 'Cause again, I think it's so great to see some of these compounds making their way through the process and actually kind of coming to closer to being, viable, available, all those things.
Yeah, I think Beckley Atai with their 5-MeO DMT nasal spray, they kind of merged recently to develop. I think that's really exciting.
Mhm.
Um, Cybin, now Helios, you called it. I
Yeah.
think they're really far along with their protocols. Like they're going to be in the kind of first major wave of approvals. And I'm only saying I'm really excited about things that I'm seeing soon in the marketplace.
Mhm.
I think there's some drugs waiting in the wings that are going to really help us. I don't even know that they're out of phase 1 yet with chronic inflammatory conditions, and that's a huge segment of American illness comes from chronic inflammatory conditions. So
Mm.
if we can start resolving those, I think a lot of other things in America kind of solve.
Mhm.
So those drugs are out there. People have some data on it already. So I was just really excited about those kinds of conditions. Um, and my work around chronic pain conditions, I'm just really excited about that. And I don't want to pitch that here, but go to Psychedelics Today to learn more.
There you go. That sounds good. Yeah, no, it is going to be really interesting. I think, of course, for a lot of these drugs, they're looking to target what affects the most people, TAM, all those things, whatever, which is important. But it'll be interesting to see as this continues to show proof and kind of proof of concept and being able to make its way through to see kind of how the, I guess, range of conditions expands, and to see what it can take on. Because you're right. I think inflammatory diseases, or I guess autoimmune diseases, similar kind of thing, are
Two sides of
hugely,
the same coin almost.
yeah, exactly. But I think they're also, I mean, not to get too, not woo woo, but something equivalent to that. I think like the human body is connected in a lot of ways. If you are stressed or depressed, I think those things can trigger. So, anyhow, either way, I think ultimately it moves towards a healthier, uh, you know, not population, but healthier people and a better experience. I think so. If we have the tools, why not tap into them? If we have the technology, why not tap into it? And I think excited to see where things go from here. So, anything we missed on sort of the psychedelic side, but then if so, let us know. And if not, I do want to kind of touch base on. I know you have a what's it called? An event coming up. Wanted to chat on that as well. Ooh.
Yeah, thanks for that. So finally, the charity I'm working with is called the Psychedelics and Pain Association. So check that out if you want to see the latest in psychedelics and pain research. And there's a company I'm working with called Remap Therapeutics that are actually doing interventions already. Very interesting stuff there. Some publications have already been out, and with the charity, we have a research project underway with Yale, which is going to
Oh,
be really exciting to get that out.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's it in terms of my psychedelic news. We always do classes, so if you want to get educated, check out what we've got in the
That's what I was
pipeline.
looking at. Seminar was the word that
Mhm.
escaped me for no reason. I know you have one coming up, I think relatively soon, right? It's programming. I said the ninth. No, that can't be right. Expanding
So
Horizon.
we have a program, a 9-week program kicking off on the 10th, called Navigating Psychedelics: Essentials of Psychedelic Therapy and Integration. It's like a 45-hour program that you go through over 9 weeks. It's a hybrid, synchronous, asynchronous program. Anybody can take it, from physicians to high school kids. So, if you're interested in having some sort of helpful orientation around psychedelics, it's a great place to start. We've also got another program kicking off called Expanding Horizons in Mental Health, Psychedelics, Depth, and the Human Psyche. It's kind of a depth psychology program that you hit a lot of different topics. So that kicks off on March 15. It's about I think it's about 6 hours in time. And you have a lot of really interesting people presenting there, from Dr. Matt Johnson at formerly at Hopkins, a big name at Hopkins, and number of other folks we've worked with for years and years. So Dr. David Lukoff, Kyle Buller, my co-founder, Yvette Vexta, Mackenzie Amara, some just really, really great folks. Um, so if you want kind of a thematic seminar in the vein of Carl Jung, it would be a really good place to start.
Yeah, very cool. I feel like you could waste 6 hours on a Netflix show or series or something like that, or put it into something that is really interesting and useful. So interesting balance
Yes.
there. Before I let you go, I do see some questions coming in. So I want to get last
Mhm.
2 questions real quick. One
Yeah.
from Dream Sleep, which is, what do you think of RFK Jr. cutting to 1 FDA trial? I'm curious there.
Hmm. So I think this process deserves a lot of deep thinking. I, on one hand, I'm like, this could expose people to a lot of risk. On the other hand, if done skillfully, I think we can save a lot of time and money with drug development. Kind of the fundamental thing I keep hearing is that FDA trials don't prove efficacy, they prove safety more than anything.
Mm.
And, as long as we're proving safety and the marketplace can kind of prove efficacy, that's pretty good. I just, don't really want consumers to bear the brunt of bad science. Um, and if they do, I would like consumers to be able to protect themselves or have some accountability, right? The recent Roundup kind of like uh, glyphosate kind of protections for big corporations. Like, we don't want more of that. We want less of that. So if you're a good faith operator bringing good drugs to market, great. and and you should have confidence that your drug is really helpful. So anyway, that's a
Releasing.
long-winded answer.
No, that's great. That's awesome. And then I'm seeing one more, which is Psychedelics and Pain Association. Is that right? So just clarifying.
Yes, Psychedelics and Pain Association, um, psychedelicsandpain.org. We have a free, very robust training that'll get people spun up on the overall orientation to uh, current science around pain generally and what we can do to potentially help a lot of people. I would say more people in America are filed for disabled status for assorted pain conditions. So if we can resolve that, we're in really good shape when we get more people back to their lives and their families.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think, again, really important work. So again, appreciate you doing all you do in terms of providing that education, putting that out there. I definitely encourage people who are listening to take a look. Some great education. I think the space requires that so much. So appreciate all the work, Joe. Thanks for spending the time as well and talking through kind of where we are, and looking forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thanks so much.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.